So, good morning, everyone. I would like to apologize for some technical issues we had here, but I think we are all set now. Well, today is the second session of our seminal talks with Professor Verónica Rodríguez-Blanco. For those who weren't here on Monday, I should say a little introduction. Professor Verónica is a Bachelor of Law from the University of Caracas in Venezuela. Then she did her Master in Philosophy at Oxford University and a PhD in Cambridge. She is now the chair of moral philosophy, is it? In the University of Surrey. Here to comment on her paper and to react in the conversation, we will have my namesake, Professor Daniel Morata. Professor Morata is graduated here at USP. He also made his master's here, and he has a PhD on the University of Surrey also. He is now a professor of legal philosophy and jurisprudence here at the University of São Paulo. And also my fellow organizer, Martin Petis. Martin is originated from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, where he got his bachelor in law. He did a master's degree here, summa cum laude, and now he's working on his PhD thesis under Professor José Reinaldo. So thank you very much for coming. I'm sorry again for the interruptions. And Professor, you may have the floor.
Yes, so the name of my chair is Moral and Political Philosophy brackets Jurisprudence, because it very well reflects the view that, you know, moral, political, legal philosophy, they are interconnected, and also legal theory. Good, so in our lecture on Monday, I was trying to demonstrate that there was a conception of the common good as a grand end, and I want to problematize it just today. And there was another conception of the common good as a merely instrumental, as the way we think probably about the spoon to stir our coffee, or a hammer to build up to build a table, or the way we use it with nails. And I was trying to show that actually there is a connection between the way we think about deliberation and practical reason and the instrumentality of the common good, and trying to show that this instrumentality is internal to this basic substantive good. Today, I'm going to concentrate on, so this is the background, and today I'm going to concentrate on a criticism of the grand end view, to start to persuade you to move into the view that I'm trying to defend. So the plight of the inexorability of the good in our collective lives, does the common good as grand end rest on a mistake? There are a plurality of goods such as justice, freedoms, self-determination, autonomy, friendship, health, life, religiosity, marriage, and so on. These are all concrete instantiations of the good simpliciter. Some philosophers have denied these. For instance, Peter Gage has asserted that good is an attributive predicate and not an adjective predicate. This means there is no such a thing as good independently of the specific object to which we attribute good. His core argument is grammatical. Good is like large or small and not like yellow. We can say that they are large ants or small ants, but a large ant does not equate to large. Hence, large or small, like good, are attributive. By contrast, yellow is a predicate, and we can determine the things that have the property yellow regardless of our attribution to them. Similarly, there are good knives and bad knives, as there are bad democracies and good democracies. But this does not mean that good knives are similar to good democracies. As we can say that brown vehicles and brown notebooks are similar as they share the property brown. Good is not a property like brown. However, in ethics and morality, we say that we pursue the good, and then ends are presented to us as if they were good. Hence, we just say that, for example, we pursue good democracies, or I desire a good knife. This seems true when we engage in practical reasoning. we need to determine the content of our desire-based ends, the what of the action, to be able to engage with the means, the how of the action. But we can still raise the question, what makes this X good? Why is this good? The latter question has been recognized as a search or interrogation guided by a known natural and indefinable property. Even if we are able to give an answer, this one is never final because someone can still intelligibly say, but why is this good? G.E. Moore thought that there was something good simplicity, and similarly Plato advances the view that good was a form or an idea. Plato provides the following analogy to understand how we should think about the good as a form or idea. The idea of the good is sun-like, and this means that like the sun, the good illuminates everything that we are able to see, grasp, understand, or make intelligible. If there were no sun, we were not able to see plants, mountains, people, oceans, and so on. However, gazing directly at the sun will result in blindness. Furthermore, if we gaze directly at the sun, it will no longer serve as a source of illumination, as it will lose its ability to illuminate. Similarly, the good illuminates the particular goods or values to which we participate. To define, grasp, identify the good simplicity directly leads to blindness. The metaphor effectively illustrates how the good simplicity guides us when we perceive something as good, as I desire a good knife, or we pursue a good democracy. We are using our practical reasoning and asking for the what of the action, guided by what is called the good question. Is this good, and why is this good? To determine whether we should pursue the respective course of action. This means that if good is fundamental for guidance and is sun-like, then all the instantiations of the good are dependent on the answer to the question, is this good in this particular action? This means that when we are faced with questions related to justice, freedom, autonomy, friendship, marriage, religiosity, health, and life, we must ask ourselves, is this good in this particular action, and why? Note that I am not suggesting that we always ask this question. It is not an empirical claim, but rather an argument about the structure of what we are asking and engaging in as we move through the process of constructing social institutions. However, an objector might argue that I have solely employed metaphors and grammar forms to establish a connection between the concepts of good, simplicity, and goods. Returning to the motivation of these lectures, as outlined in the introduction, we must scrutinize the liberal claim that we can detach the good from the right with precision and minimal laws. While the metaphor of the sun representing the good may be insightful, liberal theorists argue that officials should not interfere with a specific good. The question of the good, or even the concept of the good simplicity, even if it is a plausible philosophical account. Political reality is essentially normative disagreements, and our conception of freedom call for a determination of what is right independently of the good. However, I try to defend the idea that good and common good are architectonic. This suggests that the concept of good and our idea of it shape us. We are asking for something that concerns ourselves because it calls upon us, our very being. We pose the question, is this good and why, to ourselves, demanding an answer. This requires us to provide an answer while we are in action. The question challenges us. However, we must look beyond ourselves, focusing on the matter, the action, and our comprehension of the end to be achieved. The good question is this good and why? What constitutes the common good in this specific situation? These questions do not strive to identify a specific object, as they would if they were scientific in nature. The question invites or directs us. It is our most fundamental calling. This implies that we must initiate action through reason. We are more familiar with the modern style of philosophizing characterized by scientific, speculative, or theoretical thinking. However, the good question methodology is at the core of practical reasoning, as opposed to theoretical reasoning. It is always in the background. It frames everything we engage with, but at the same time, it is at a distance. It is sunlike. However, the theoretical or scientific way of thinking is difficult to resist, and theories tend to advocate the view that the common good is either A, a simple instrument, as enablers such as spoon I use to stir the sugar in my coffee, or B, a grand end, and that the state's officials aim to achieve.
This reading leads us to the conclusion that either explicitly or implicitly there is a substantive end, a what, upon which we can begin our deliberation. The formal end of living well is fused with the idea of a substantive or restricted end that guides our deliberation and actions. Aristotle's comparison with theoretical reasoning and use of the examples of a geometrical figure might invite us to think that Aristotle's analogy leads to the fusion of practical deliberation and theoretical reasoning. However, the analogy between deliberation and tracing and geometrical figure focuses on something different. In the first lecture, I think during the Q&A, we get the example of the parallelogram. So therefore, we must presuppose and hold the what, here the parallelogram in our example, formulate the question and articulate an answer as if we knew the what, as if we had clarity of the figure, right? The analogy also enables us to understand what we decompose and translate the what into parts until we reach the point of insight into how to start action. However, the idea that the what of the official's action can be the common good as the grand end, and that officials are able to promote this grand end rests on a number of mistaken theses that are aimed to undermine. I will now shift my focus to this investigation. So the common good as grand end as a necessary postulate for the justification of deliberation and rational decision. In contemporary philosophy, following the bifurcation and the balanced view of deliberation involves the view that we need to be able to justify our deliberations and actions. The idea of the common good as grand end provides precisely this grounding. An official chooses X as a means to Y because she considers Y to be good or best. The official's value judgment is that the common good as end, the what, is worth. And therefore the deliberation and action that leads towards this achievement are impregnated by the worthiness of the end as common good. However, to determine its worthiness, the official cannot question whether in this particular circumstance it is the best way to act. In contrast, the Aristotelian-inspired notion of practical deliberation does not view the grounds of deliberation and rational decision as the end, as it is the process of deliberation that unveils the end. However, the process of unveiling, refining, discovering and rediscovering of the end, the what, involves both the transformation of desires and the performance of our intelligence in thinking. Therefore, it is always sensible to ask whether pursuing the good base end, the what, under this particular circumstance is good. Thus, to discover that X, A, B, A1, and A and B1 are the how to obtain a more determinate common good base end, the what, is to pursue it now and therefore to start doing A1. However, if then the what has been unveiled and the deliberator subsequently has a better grasp of the what, it always makes sense to revise it and change it or even abandon it. In contrast, the common good as grand end, which conflates formal and substantive ends, precludes any questioning of these ends and principles. Furthermore, if there is a grand end or substantive end, it remains unchanged and identical through the circumstances and over time. Moreover, the common good as grand end theories could codify the grand end into a set of rules and principles, thereby solving the problem of guidance to which we now turn. Second point. So the common good as grand end view explains the view that we need guidance in reality. The second tenet of the common good as a grand end is that we need guidance in our deliberations. When we desire and pursue the common good as a grand end in isolation from specific circumstances, it must manifest as a universal, a rule, or a principle. However, Aristotle emphasized that we aim at the end, the what, as a particular within a specific circumstances. In other words, the end, the what, is indeterminate. As a result, the following question arises. How can an indeterminate entity, independent of specific circumstances, guide officials? The Aristotelian-inspired model that I defend is far more modest. Practical deliberation entails a step in the darkness and involves deliberating and acting according to what is best, or what seems best in the official's eyes in the circumstances. However, how do we know what is best in the circumstances where the substantive end is indeterminate or unclear? Deliberation precisely answers the question, what should I do? By addressing the how do I do it question. Officials can only decompose and translate the indeterminate what and understand the end by investigating the piecemeal, the how. This involves understanding the common good as embedded in our understanding of the plurality of goods. This is an internal instrumental view of the common good. As a result, there is no standard external to the deliberative process that guarantees the correctness of the answer. Excellence in deliberation and the excellence exercise of practical reasoning, promises, guide officials in defining their aspirational what. Officials learn basic end concepts and good concepts from the political and legal community, including traditions and history. Officials develop perceptive and cognitive capacities due to excellence in deliberation and practical reasoning. Promises of practical wisdom is precisely what guides them, but it is not conceived as a given reality, a given substantive end, or a set of principles of rules, but something that officials constantly exercise and cultivate towards an aspirational point. Third feature. So the common good as grand end view presupposes that selection of the end, the what, is intuitive or implicit, and a causal conception of the how. So when considering the common good as the grand end view, intelligence does not always play a crucial role in choosing the end. Theorists and commentators on the Aristotelian view on practical syllogism understand it as follows. The major premise functions as what is good, while the minor premise provides the basis for deliberation. The major premise is interpreted as the rule or principle of action, and the minor premise is a set of facts that are apprehended and can be subsumed under the rule or principle. This is very familiar for lawyers, I think. For instance, Cooper, who is a great commentator on Aristotle, posits that intuition grasps the substantive end of the major premise, which is the rule of principle. Other authors argue that the deliberator grasps both the minor and the major premise, which she does by intuition. Following this scheme,
We could say that the facts or means that are the content of the minor premise are causes that lead us to the satisfaction of the principles, rules, and therefore to the substantive end of the major premise. According to this viewpoint, the starting point of deliberation, the how, and then the liberative point, the what, are clear and visible or implicit and may be discerned through reflection. Furthermore, intuition apprehends the rule, principle, or substantive end, while our reasoning intelligence play no role. The deliberation truly begins with the second premise. As a result, the deliberator must engage with the necessary circumstances and facts that will satisfy the substantive end or principle. The minor premise does not impact the major premise. This view of practical syllogism is too simplistic to represent the complexity and richness of the deliberative process. Arguably, we need to problematize the view that the practical syllogism is an exact representation of deliberation. Practical syllogism's role is to formally represent deliberation when we need to achieve its responsibility to explain what has failed when executing a deliberated decision, the prohairesis, but it does not explain the workings of deliberation and its complexity. There are passages in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that might seem to support the grand end view. According to this view, we need something that mediates between the substantive end and the particular. There is a subtle thread of irrationality if we just desire or apprehend the substantive end, the what, by intuition. We need a bridge between the end, the what, and the particular. Principles and rules can play that role. And here we see the need to interpret the major premise as a rule or principle. The rule or principle will serve as the bridge between the substantive end and the particular individual facts and circumstances. The principle or the rule performs all the work, leaving practical intelligence out of the picture. However, if the analogy with theoretical reasoning is kept in mind, it is possible that what Aristotle is trying to convey in this passage is that we wish for the end, the what is only provisional. I have similarly tried to demonstrate that the what is indeterminate and reveal over time. The clarity of the what is obtained after engaging in deliberation. So the focus is on the intelligibility of particulars attained via the exercise of thinking and investigating in contingent and constantly varying circumstances. Let me provide a particular example: health. Imagine legislators who are tasked with determining whether a specific public health system is the most conducive to the overall health of the population, and then creating appropriate legislation to implement it. Officials need to grasp the what of the action, why, by doing the how of the action, namely A1 and B1, and thus by determining what A1 and B1 require. Health of the population is the indeterminate and abstract goal, why. The what of the action we can only be achieved by means the instrumental common good decomposing a specific how on the initial actions A, B, A1, and B1. The mean A might be determining the infrastructure for the health system, and the mean B might be creating the conditions for the long-term stability for the best possible care, including medical and nursing training. The means AB shed light on two actions: A1, which could involve designing and building local and national hospitals, and B1, which involves creating a series of incentives aimed at attracting and creating the best medical training for the health system. Understanding A1 and B1 is not possible without understanding A and B. Understanding the how of the series of actions is the only way to fully grasp why. The indeterminate good of the population's health. Understanding the specifics of their population's health, such as the prevalence of diseases, the disparity in health access between rural and urban areas, the mistrust and attitudes of minority groups towards the medical health professionals, and the evaluation and validity of preventative medicine, is crucial to fully understand the how of the series of actions. Simultaneously, the how shed light on the specific of the actions, namely the health of the population in its concrete particularities. Compare these to the utilitarian conception of health as a goal. By finding a measurement that unifies and simplifies the reasoning and connection between the what and how of an action, such as cost-benefit analysis, health can be reduced to a good. In contrast, the Aristotelian-inspired model of practical reason, which we aim to advance, emphasizes the importance of non-reductionism and the pursuit of shedding light on the common good in the first, second, and third sense of the first lecture, as we remember. So the good refers to orientation, and the good question serves as a guide for action based on this orientation. The example, while obviously simplified, demonstrates how our understanding of the instrumental common good is internal to our understanding of the plurality of goods, including health. A similar reasoning applies to the common good and its relationship to the plurality of basic goods, such as justice, freedom, self-determination, authority, health, life, religiosity, marriage, friendship, community, environment. We learn about tolerance as well, animals, well-being, our creature fellows. However, if the view of practical reason that I have defended rejects the common good as grand end view, how can we explain the role of principles and rules in our lives? Is it counterintuitive to assert that principles and rules do not play any influence in our deliberations? The aspirational view of the what holds that the starting point of deliberation is indeterminate, as shown in the analogy between deliberation in tracing and geometrical figure. There is no obstacle to the development of choices that might become rules or principles. Consequently, we can still uphold an aspirational conception of practical reason that leads to the establishment of a substantive end, principles or rules, which are grasped and clarified during or after the deliberation process. By contrast, according to the common good as grand end view, we form our choices based on pre-existing standards, principles, and rules. One key feature of the aspirational conception is the idea that, using the example of health, A1 and B1 represent the official's insights on infrastructure and medical training to create a health system. However, this insight goes beyond mere technical knowledge. We had this conversation on Monday as well, right, with Professor Reinaldo. It necessitates a certain sensitivity towards the fundamental good question: is this good and why? Yeah, as a contrast to, for example, the dentist. The dentist doesn't ask, is aligned teeth good or why, right? Because it is important for nutrition, yeah, and a correct biting. Mm-hmm. Something, the standard of correctness is the external to the activity. Mm-hmm. So the general lesson is that we can only grasp the universal through action and within what is particular and circumstantial. Furthermore, if deliberation and rational decisions, pro-hierarchies, are conceived as deliberation directed towards the common good as grand end, then the role of officials' character and their transformation are unclear. Arguably, reflective policies for decision-making will also adhere to the idea of a determinate substantive end, or what. For instance, in the example health, the officials in the ideal case will have a clear vision of the population's health and will implement reflective policies or perhaps a life plan for the country that will help to actualize what they have in mind. However, this view is problematic, and it assumes that there is no connection between our intelligence and the officials' lower desires and emotions, such as ambition, greed, egoism, and so on. And I think we can discuss that. I think the origin of, in a way, liberalism is not only that we essentially disagree on normative concepts, but actually is about our rational egoist nature as well. So it's two pillars of why the liberalist solution, right? However, such theories fail to explain the way desires and our intelligence interact. According to the common good as grand end view, the liberation and rational decision proheiresis cannot connect to officials' lower desires unless principles and rules are established. And as a result, arguably, rational decision proheiresis collapses into rational justification. Consequently, officials need to resort to principles, codes, or rules to guide us and allow themselves to descend to their lower desires. So that's the diagnosis of the grand end. Thank you very much for your patience.
So thank you, Professor Veronica, very much for the lecture. And now to the comments. Well, traditions of the house says that the youngest should speak first. So Martin, yeah, it's a tradition, we have to keep it. Otherwise, we're nothing. So I yield the floor to Martin.
Thank you very much, Professor Veronica, for taking the time and the effort to discuss and deliberate with us here, and for taking this long flight to São Paulo. And I want to thank you also for the opportunity to be here to speak with you, to talk with you a little bit more about this subject, which is really important for me. Was my subject on my dissertation, at least the question of practical reason, the fear of action. So your work was really inspiring to me, in the sense that you use Elizabeth Anscombe's work and worked a lot on it. So I have my written comment that I shall read to avoid mistakes in my English. And let me check the time. So, right, well, Professor Verónica Rodríguez-Blanco takes a stand in her series of lectures against two conceptions of the common good. On the one hand, there is this view of the common good as purely instrumental, which compares its role in law and politics to tools. On the other hand, there is the view of the common good as a grand end, which equates it with a fixed higher moral principle, or series of principles, that every official should strive to achieve. Both visions go against the classical model of practical reason advocated by Professor Verónica Rodríguez-Blanco, which she calls sometimes classical, inspired by Aristotle, deliberative, and finally aspiration. I would like here to explore and make sense of a possible distortion of legal decision-making, one of them, that is incompatibility between her conception of practical reason and the grand end view specifically of the common good could generate. So the explanation of an action as an action must consider the explanation of an agent's intention to be relevant. This means that the agent's direction or inclination towards the world is decisive or central to the description of his action. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand ourselves as subjects driven by goals, choices, inclinations, and plans. We conceive of ourselves as agents of our lives, even when we think about it only to say how tragic it was not to make some choice that we consider important. And when we realize that a belief that formed our intention in the past was false, our whole description of the action can change, and so can its value or importance. This reasoning is really common for lawyers, if we think about it. If it is discovered, for example, that a contract was made in the past under unconscionability, for us in Brazil, lesão, estudo da lesão. That is, when a person under urgent necessity or due to inexperience obliges himself to a performance manifestly disproportionate to the value of the opposite performance, the initial description that there was a contract is destroyed. This contract is void ab initio, it never existed. The conception of the common good defended by Professor Rodríguez-Blanco is based on a certain conception of action, which she opposed to the so-called balancing conception, a corollary of the bifurcation model. This view is associated with David Hume and has had a lot of great representatives in the 20th century, such as the American philosopher Donald Davidson. For the second view, the ends of our actions are given by our nature, and we don't question them through reason. Reason simply can't help us defines them. As she said, and I quote, We do not engage in shaping, determining, and discriminating between what is right, unjust, dutiful, good, or evil. Reason only helps us to find the most efficient means of realizing what we already want to do. However, not every motivation makes an action intelligible or meaningful. Desire is what motivates us, and it's usually the product of a state of mind or a belief. When we want to understand what was the desire that motivated a person, we will ask why they acted as they did. But we only accept certain justifications as intelligible. So if I ask, what am I doing here? I say that I'm making an academic comment on Professor Veronica's lecture. You might agree that I'm doing this action, although you might question whether I'm really doing it well. This is other question. My belief in the adequacy of the means I have chosen to realize my end may be false after all. Now, if I respond to you to this why question by saying that I'm here because I want to test the acoustics of the room by making sounds with my voice, you could quite rightly question my seriousness and my sanity. Normally, we don't even need to ask this question. The meaning of their action is transparent to us. So the motive does not necessarily enter into the into the explanation because it can't give a social meaning to what I'm doing. There are also logical limits to what we can desire. As Elizabeth Anscombe says, if a person answers this, why did you do that question, with the response, philosophers have taught me that I can want anything, then that person must be clueless. She doesn't know what she's doing. If I were to claim here that I make my comments, say, to be a good football player or a recognized doctor or physician, again, I would sound very strange. Our intentions relate then to a desirable pattern of action by reference to ends that we already understand as desirable. For Anscombe, I quote, truth is the object of judgment, the good is the object of the will. With the difference that the theoretical truth is attributed to judgment without depending on the perspective of the agent who formulates it. The good in action, by the other hand, is the characteristic that, from the agent's perspective, makes that action desirable. It's only because of this belief that he can be inclined to do it. As long as the standard refers to a known good, the action can be intelligible, even if it is not, at the end of the day, the best action, all things considered. These two arguments against the balancing conception of action, I think, come from the work of Anscombe and Joseph Ras in the fields of the theories of action and value. They inform the argument of Professor Veronica. Their arguments help us to understand the inadequacy of a purely instrumental view of the common good. Now, in her presentation, Professor Veronica also suggests that liberal political theories also give a distorted explanation of our practical thinking. Maybe John Rawls could be the main proponent of the political view I have in mind here, because he derives the common interests of all citizens in equal liberty and fair opportunity from a conception of right. In a sense, he does speak about the common good. And if I am correct in this interpretation, we could associate it with a form of grand end view, a fixed, founded principle founded by theoretical reason. So it allows officials that reason in good faith about what to do to codify principles that should guide their action of all official authority. So I want to question Professor Veronica here about the impacts of this conception on legal decision-making, given her understanding that every action makes sense by reference to its desirability characteristics or to its goodness. I think that this is important because, as she said in the first lecture, a corollary of these liberal political theories is the view that official authorities should not engage really in arguments about what constitutes the good for a political community. This presupposes that officials can identify the right action without engaging with the concept of a good life. So Ronald Dworkin, for example, assumes that it is uncontroversial in modern Western political societies that political equality is the right of every citizen to receive equal concern and respect from their government is the main value that legitimizes the action of governments. This foundational principle dictates that, and I quote him, political decisions must be, so far as is possible, independent of any particular conception of the good life or what gives value to life. And with this in mind, Dworkin justifies the political obligation of citizens in the name of fraternity, a sense of mutual respect between citizens in a community of principle. So proponents of this argument of the priority of the right over the good prioritize a moral theory based on rights and not on goals or aims that every human being should consider to be intrinsically valuable. Based on some universal characteristic of human beings, such as reason or their inherited dignity, or special moral status is affirmed, from which general moral principles can be drawn. These principles serve to block trade-offs between fundamental demands and interests. As important as an interest of an agent or a collectivity may be, it cannot outweigh a right derived from a moral principle such as the dignity of the human person or his individual freedom. By disregarding our conceptions of the good as central to moral theory, I think at least the right-based theories consider that the loss in our moral reasoning is minimal. I think here that Professor Veronica is arguing that the loss is enormous, based on her arguments about the nature of practical reason. So what do I think is this loss? At the end of her paper, Professor Veronica states that the vision of the common good as the grand end does not allow us to clearly understand the role of officials. Public policies are going to have to adhere to substantive ideas of desirable ends, whether they like it or not. It is in the nature of action, as I say in the beginning, to be intelligible by reference to its ends. However, in the professor's view, the vision of the common good as the grand end makes, I quote her, deliberation and rational decision, prohairesis, to collapse into rational justification. It is not exactly clear to me what this amounts to, exactly, so I would like to propose, and to hear you more, Professor, in the end of my comment, which is finishing, an interpretation of this argument with the help of the philosophy of Charles Taylor, a non-communitarian. I believe that the conception of the common good as the grand end can be associated with what Taylor calls moral theories based on hypergoods. By reference to theoretical reason, disengaged from arguments about the good, these theories seek to affirm goods that constitute a higher moral conscience that overcomes practices and beliefs considered outdated. These goods are, and I quote him, goods which not only are incomparably more important than others, but that provide the standpoint from which these must be weighed, judged, decided about. However, the error in the theory of action and decision contained in this statement, would say Taylor, I think, is that we can only accept a hypergood as a rational justification if we are already moved by it. That is, we can already perceive it as reasonable and desirable for our actions and plans and inclinations. Of course, what motivates us can be derived from a false belief. But for Taylor, the point here is that the only way to evaluate our moral beliefs is to put them in full confrontation, as in a Socratic dialectical debate, which I think is an important idea for Professor Veronica, where we seek to put the other person at odds or to show how some of the consequences of their beliefs are inadmissible at the end. Liberal political theories presuppose a good to be pursued by official authorities, but they consider its justification of their claim that this justification is theoretical rather than practical. The principles that these theories assert as the grand end would then, I say with Taylor, and I quote him, look like formal principles, but only because they are so foundational to the moral thinker of our civilization. We should endeavor to formulate the underlying moral insights just as clearly and expressly as we do all others, unquote. So it seems to me, finally, that the loss that this conception generates to our legal reasoning is that it hinders the very discussion of what we value, giving excessive weight to some goods. The Dworkinian view can only think of the common good primarily in terms of the guarantee of rights related to individual freedom. But we can answer, for example, that not every governmental action and not every duty imposed to citizens are justified directly from individual rights. This is the case of common goods, goods that are valued by everyone only in a very diffuse way, such as the protection of the environment or tolerance, for example. In The Morality of Freedom, Joseph Raz reminds us that a government that promotes these goods, creating, for example, a more tolerant society, generates a general and common benefit for all individuals that is non-excludable. This good cannot be achieved for one member of the group without being achieved for the others. At the same time, it is fundamental for everyone to live in such a society if they value autonomy for themselves. We should even think if citizens have a right to guarantee of these common goods, sometimes even overriding individual rights. Having said that, and I would like to hear Professor Veronica then about the extent to which liberal political theories makes mistakes about the phenomenology of our actions, and whether these mistakes really have the impact on political philosophy that an author like Charles Taylor attributes to them. To formulate my comment in the form of a question: does the vision of the common good as a grand end give excessive prevalence or weight to individual rights or individual goods in detriment of rights to common goods? That will be the question. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martin. There's a lot there, and it's very rich, and in a way you're anticipating some of the work I want to do and develop, which is obviously the connection between rights and the conception of the common good, and more specifically related to freedom. But you interpret, and I like that very much, and I like that you saw that. I was trying to give a preliminary view that the common good as a grand end, what is behind is exactly the liberal tradition. Yeah, so that was very good, but I don't say much about that in the paper, but that's something to develop. But I want to give a lot of ammunition to that here, just as an open conversation, yeah, to continue the conversation. So understand that some of these bits are not in the paper, but I think they're an expansion on the paper, yes, on the ideas. So I'm going to divide my commentaries into 3 sections. One on your observations on practical reason, the others on the question of rational justification, and finally on the difficult question of rights. So on practical reason, I think you're right, the enormous inspiration on Elizabeth Anscombe, but there is a limitation on the work of Anscombe, and specifically her working intention, because she focuses only on intention. And I'm trying to explain all the spectrum of agency that includes acrasia, that includes encratic behavior, and also vicious behavior and evil behavior. So it will be the paradigmatic example of action is intentional action, but then I'm trying to explain all the actions in which, in a way, emotions are not aligned with our thinking. And that has forced me to go back to Aristotle and think very carefully about the 2 analogies that we talk about on Monday. The analogy, he thinks that practical reason, to understand really what practical reason is we need to understand both analogies, how theoretical reasoning in geometry and mathematics works, and how the practical aspect, the contingency aspect of us in our life works through actually the analogy of the craft, no? And these are, remember, it's not like practical reason is craft. It's not that practical reason is theoretical. It's that practical reason is between both. It's a mediator between both, has elements of both. These are just analogies. So, so I want to reflect a bit because you talk about choice, yeah? And I think that there is something about choice that is different in the model of the Aristotelian-inspired vision that I'm trying to advance. And choice in the classical tradition is something that is a component of the process of thinking and aligning our desires. Because the liberation, which is the core of practical reason, is actually settling an answer to the question, what shall I do? Right? It's not that you are, but this is, remember, this is a thinking about the structure of how you act, how agency operates, how action works. So you try to settle the question. And the way you try to settle the question is that you see the end as an indeterminate. That's what you desire. Yeah. In the example of health, that's the aim that you desire. And then it's through the liberation of the ends that this desire and to the end becomes clearer to you. And then that feeds back itself on the means, and then the means at the end, when they're refined, feed back on the end. So this is the vision of choice, where you think, and Aquinas talks about choice, but Aristotle doesn't talk about choice, because choice is about will. Yes. So he talks about voluntariness, which is a very complicated concept. I'm not going to get into this, but there's a history of the will written by Michael Frede. He thinks that actually the notion of will emerges with Alexander Aphrodisias. And then, as we know, after that, we have St. Augustine, and then this emergence of the conception of the will as separate from thinking and as separate from pure desire. But I want to keep this more tidy and think in the terms of only the thinking process we have, and then our character or desires, and how they can be aligned or disaligned. So one important aspect as well of settling an answer to the question, what shall I do in the particular circumstances when I act, is that there is a diachronic structure of it, right? So, and you well pointed out that when we look, there's a backward looking, and then we reflect on the character of the action, and then we change on the meaning of the action. And I think you're correct on that. And that means that taking responsibility is because you really understand, you are the cause of what you understand. You know what you're doing. But only looking backward is you understand the meaning of what you have done, if you have done something wrong. And then there's a whole explanation, and that's what I try to explain with Socratic action. On your second point on just what rational justification, and I think there is an underlying premise here that is not, I think, unpacked completely in the series of lectures. And the question is why rational justification is presented as the solution. And it's presented as a solution because what Daniel Lay will call modernity. One feature of modernity is what we essentially disagree on our normative concepts. So we disagree on the character of life. We disagree on the character of love, friendship, sexuality. Right? In the modern world, there is an essential disagreement on substantive aspects of how we ought to live, or why we shall live, or how we live. But there is another element, that there is a presupposition that we are rational egoists, and that we look our self-interest, and that there is no remedy for that. So then the government, so that most of the solutions on political authority, the solution is to present, you know, the famous Rust advanced idea of exclusionary reasons for actions that has a content on the reasons applies to you, to the citizen. And there is the possibility of consensus. There's the possibility, and these are all in branches of rational justification, yeah, in terms of reasons, either because there are second-order reasons or because there is the rational consensus, and that's how we accept authority. But these solutions have nothing to do with the transformation in the maturity of the agent, of the subject. Yeah, has nothing to do with our lower desires, has nothing to do with rational egoism, because they accept the Hobbesian premise that we are rational egoists. And this is precisely, and we know that Bernard Williams, this is what he hooks into. This practical reason of the Aristotelian is not feasible. It is not possible to become mature, to have a virtuous life, and then on the other hand, we have justice and freedom. We have to choose. And then therefore, if we choose justice and freedom, and it's our relationship with a stranger what really matters, it has to do in a way that is different than the classical tradition invites us to do. So this is the other premise, yes? And I'm trying to actually, I'm not doing it in the lectures, but this is what I'm trying to resist in the work. So when we're seeking the good, we are necessarily seeking it together as a political community. That's another thing I'm trying to advance. It's not in the lectures, but it's actually a branch out, that we're deliberating in a Socratic way together. So it's actually in the syndicate, the unions, is in the community, in the church, where is in the council, is through the legislator, is in the court, where we are trying to understand, seek together, give an answer to the question, what shall I do, as settling an answer together. And that's doing what we call a Socratic dialogue. So that's the idea, is that we cannot start from nothing. We start always from the community. There is no seeking in isolation. There's also a constant dialogue with others, and that we are confronted with others constantly. No, what are you doing? We are shaped in our aspirations, in our actions, and our values by the confrontation with others. And that is a given. That is what is given. And we cannot escape that. And that's why at the beginning of the lectures, I start with the paradox of the rational egoist and more, trying to argue that if there is a good, is as a guiding question, as an idea, but it has not substantive content. Yeah, it's not something I can own. It's not the good for me as I own the horse. No. But on the other hand, of course, you can formulate it as an attributive. So it means that this is a good democracy in this context, in these circumstances, answering the question, what shall I do in terms of procedural process in the democratic system that we're living in? So there's no such a thing as a good for me. If the good guides us as a form in our seeking, we are actually trying in a way to unify these. And this is how the rational egoist moves into maturity, through the law, through the deliberation. Now, the problem with the instrumental view is the good is just a pure spoon or a pure hammer in the pure instrumentality. Then all of a sudden it loses the meaning for me. So I see these beautiful buildings. I see these wonderful laws. I see these wonderful roads, but I don't know what they are for. That they have nothing, or they are for aims that have nothing to do with me, because I didn't deliberate on them, because there was no process of the how and the what together. So if the common good is a grand end that is imposed, is also something that is alien to me. Is tyranny. There's no invitation to participate in constructing. So I'm trying to show the common good is an outcome of a process of deliberation. And we were saying yesterday that that's on Monday, that's the point of the Socratic dialogue, when we have a dialogue and you formulate in a precise and rigorous way an argument, and I'm trying to undermine your premises. There's an equality. I'm taking you so seriously that I'm engaging with your premises. And I'm engaging your premises. So it's not only an epistemic issue, the way of philosophy. The method of philosophy is also a political point. It's a political point that we are equal through rational thought. And I think Russ is right when he says one of the hypergoods, this is introduced autonomy, and actually the state needs to provide the capacity and skills for thinking, for education. And I think because this practical reasoning is a primary good. So rights do not, on the rights, it seems to me that rights do not oppose good. Because I understand, as you can see now, that rights are really architectonic. You cannot avoid it because it's something presented to me, and this is the key argument about the nature of us, is something is presented to me, is presented in the guise of the good. It's presented as, I need to get it for my thirst. I need to get these pills for my headache. I need to go to build the most beautiful building for this city that I love, and so on and so on. So everything we do depends, because I want to write the ideas that Martin has just formulated. Everything is formulated in terms, yes, you're right, in terms of an end, but this end is seen as worthwhile, as something we should do, something we ought to do, as perceived, of course, no, as a believed good, not as a subjective good. And the rights, so here's the idea. So it seems to me that they are hypergoods. Right? This is Charles Taylor. Thank you so much for bringing him into the conversation. Quite important. So he thinks that they are hypergoods. So now my question, is personal autonomy a hypergood? If Rice is right, I'm not sure. Because now I'm thinking, if you claim that you can't really intend autonomy. Autonomy cannot be an end, can be? There's something strange about saying health is an end. The knowledge of the children through the library is an end. Friendship in the community is an end. But there's something strange about saying autonomy is the end. I'm not quite sure about it, and I want to hear more. What do you think? And I'm thinking that if there's autonomy is too close to practical reason, actually. That is the problem. Yeah. So maybe the only hypergood is practical wisdom and practical reason, the excellence in the exercise. But it's not outside of the exercise. That's the paradoxical aspect. Now, I think if they are right, they are grounding on all the activities we do. So the right to self-respect, the right to dignity is a grounding and emerges only when it's violated. So we do the activity, and I put this example in another paper. We do, let us suppose I'm a conductor of an orchestra, and I'm pursuing a specific value that is described by me as a conductor as producing the most beautiful piece for the concert. So we have practices, we have certain timetables, and grounding all these activities of performing in the most beautiful possible way, grounding is what? Is the right of respect of all the musicians, is the right of dignity of all these musicians. And it only emerges when it's violated in the activity. Is violated in the activity, and then is adversarial. So I don't think that's correct that say right tracks good or tracks the will, or it emerges because it is a presupposition, I think, of practical reason. But I have to refine this. I'm not quite sure about this. Tolerance, not sure. So let me translate tolerance into my Aristotelian vocabulary. So it seems to me tolerance is very close to encratic. Encratic means that you see the value of the thing, but you don't engage because it is not part of something that you want to engage with it. You appreciate it, you see it, no, but there's no engagement, full engagement. It's not robust for you. So is this a stable? I don't think so, because this value, if you're an encratic and you just contain your hate towards this value, it can go the other way. It can go as, you know, you start to conceive this value as something you start to hate, or this value you can develop as a phronist, you can engage with this value completely and become part of you. But there's something unstable about tolerance that bothers me. I don't think it, from the point of view of practical reason, doesn't make any sense to me. Where do you locate it in the world of practical rationality, in a robust conception of practical reason? How stable is? And I think you have to introduce something else. So you have to introduce love, I think, but I'm not sure. Okay, so good. So there's something paradoxical. I think that's why it worries you, that the hyper goods are so predominant that they are never how they are realized, how they are actualized. Yeah, if they are hyper good, so you say they are there, no? But probably the explanation of right underpinning, though the activities, is that's where they are, these hypergoods, question mark. I'm not quite sure. I think the problem is that the hypergoods suppress the deliberation, suppress the way in which we could. It's interesting because in the liberal view, the private was supposed to be there, no, not mixing with the public sphere. And then what happened is a spillover. It is inevitable. So the question of sexuality spills over this public sphere now. No, the fundamental questions, because we were trying to keep the private and the public suppressed. The private suppressed, leaving the public, and the private is a matter of, you know, when we close the doors of our house, but not anymore, I think. And the whole discussion of the nature of sexuality and so on demonstrates that you cannot suppress it. So that's thank you so much. It's very thought-provoking, Martin. So maybe you have an answer on these hypergoods, or you understand it better than me. No?
No, I think that's the main point, the suppressing of deliberation.
Mhm.
But the other questions are thoughts right now, and you made a lot of incentivize a lot of other thoughts on the subject that I wouldn't have an answer to it. It's more thought provoking.
Yeah, I think we should have a seminar number 2. We
Yeah,
need to see a
yeah.
seminar 2 together.
You
Yeah.
are already invited.
If it's true dialogical, yeah, we have to have it with it as a dialogue. Yeah.
So for his comments, please, Professor Daniel Morata. The wireless one? Okay. All gonna go. One stars.
So, good morning, everyone. It's a great privilege to be here today. And if I may be excused, I would like to begin with a short biographical note. One of the things that I consider myself to be lucky is that I had many excellent teachers and supervisors during my academic career, my short academic career. So, for instance, Professor Ronaldo, who is online, was my supervisor during my undergrad and master's. Professor José Reinaldo was my first-year teacher on legal methodology at the time. During my PhD at Surrey, I had the privilege of having Steve Biro and Rep. Asgerson as my supervisors, and we used to have 2 monthly meetings of at least 2 hours every month during the whole PhD. So that I think I gave them a lot of work. But I'd like to think that in an important sense, I actually had 3 supervisors. So Professor Veronica, she was the coordinator of the PhD when I was on Surrey, and she was always attentive, kind, and thought-provoking. She was the examiner of both my confirmation exam, which is the equivalent to qualificação, and my final viva exam, which is the defesa de tese. So she was on both my examinations, and at the time, she was running a weekly reading group on philosophy of action. We have read, I think it was Anscombe, Sarah Brody, Bernard Williams, John Hyman, Nomi Arpali, and so on. It was lots of fun. So for me, it's a great honor to be here, to be able to comment on Veronica's work. So I'd like to thank Professor José Reinaldo, Martin, Daniel, and all the organizers of this amazing series of lectures. Now, moving to my comments, I would like to, of course, it's focused on the second lecture. It will spill a little bit on the first one, and I might spoiler a bit the one from Friday, but it's focused on this lecture of today. And I think it will also deviate a bit from the other commentators, mostly because I am the least sympathetic, I think, regarding the idea of the common good. And my commentary will focus on the ideas of practical deliberation, this justification of coercion, the common good, and what I call in the demand of truthfulness that is typical of modernity. And the main claim I want to advance is that we can accept Veronica's account of practical deliberation, but acceptance of her account of practical deliberation does not take us to an endorsement of any specific notions of the common good. This, in turn, and this is the claim I'll try to put forward, takes us to a distinction between justice between individuals on one hand and political justice on the other. So let me begin by saying something about Veronica's defense of an Aristotelian account of practical deliberation, or at least how I understand it. So she calls her view the aspirational view, and sometimes, and this is the view that she wants to criticize, people think about practical deliberation as if it were some kind of means-end relationship in which we already know for certain what is it that we are trying to pursue. This view that she criticizes, this sort of means view, this view presupposes that we have clarity about our ends, that we have clarity about the things we want to pursue. And this is unrealistic in at least 2 different ways. Firstly, this view wrongly assumes that we have that kind of knowledge, foresight about what is it that we want to achieve. Now, I believe that I do not speak only for myself, that I had absolutely no idea of what law school was like before getting myself into law school. And of course, I had absolutely no idea of what a life in the law means before living in the law. So this is the first point. It's unrealistic to presuppose we have the kind of knowledge most of views on practical reason thinks that we have. Secondly, and this is, I think, the key point of Veronica's account of practical reasoning, the traditional view, the view that I just mentioned, the mainstream view, this view ignores that we actually change ourselves. We shape ourselves through deliberation. Through practical deliberation, and that's Veronica's claim, as I understand it, we come to inhabit an aspirational point of view in which we simultaneously unveil our ends and ourselves. I do not think that it would be wrong to claim that, in her view, through our engagement with practical deliberation, we come to find things about our very selves. But at the same time, neither ourselves or our ends are simply given. So this process of practical deliberation in Veronica's account is at the same time both truthful and creative. Because at the same time we are unveiling things, we're being creative as well. It's not just a matter of finding out something that was hidden from us. So it's both truthful and creative. And I believe this model that Veronica proposes brings in some interesting advantages. So I'd like to emphasize one advantage that this model brings to the table. It enables us to overcome what I take to be a rather sterile, a rather unfruitful dichotomy between two views on practical reason. On the one hand, we have what is sometimes called reasons internalism, and on the other, what is sometimes called reasons externalism. Now, briefly put, reasons internalists, they hold that there can only be reasons for action that are somehow derived from a person's subjectivity, from a person's internal point of view. So reasons internalists believe that you can only have a reason for action if we can get this reason from your subjectivity. On the other hand, reasons externalists, they hold that there can be reasons for action for you, even if there is no way to derive this reason from your subjectivity, which means basically that there can be reasons for action for you, even if you utterly fail to perceive them as reasons. So there was a gigantic debate of internalism versus externalism, but this debate, I think, at the end, it gets too technical, too theoretical, and not really about the practical anymore. So one of the advantages of Veronica's model, I believe, is that it enables us to bypass this debate. It makes no sense within this aspirational model to think of reasons as either external or internal. Rather, practical deliberation is a dynamic process that has a temporal dimension to it. We actually come to have new reasons as we engage ourselves in deliberation. So it makes no sense really to think, oh, it's external or internal. The question loses its object. Now, circling back to law and politics, there can be no doubt, I think, that we engage with some sort of this kind of deliberation when we try to understand what health or education, knowledge, etc. means in terms of the political. We do engage in this sort of practical deliberation, trying to unveil what actually those goods mean. There is no such thing as the good of health in abstract terms. It's the good of health for this community as we unveil that. Now, although the background philosophical assumptions are remarkably distinct, this procedure is rather similar to John Rawls's reflexive equilibrium. The difference, I think, between this model and Rawls's reflective equilibrium, I think, is that Rawls sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he writes as if his model were too theoretical, not a practical one, but a theoretical one. But that aside, the important similarity is that we actually do not know where our deliberation will take us. We do not know where we will end. Now, when you look at particular goods, and now starting to, that was to build my criticism. When we look at particular goods, health or knowledge, there seems to be an important difference between those particular goods, health, knowledge, so on the one hand, and the common good on the other hand. Most particular goods can be translated as a right. We can speak rather interchangeably about a right to health or the good of health, a right to knowledge, to education, and the good of education. And of course, sometimes we might presumably think that to speak about a right to health or a right to knowledge or to education makes more sense in the political arena, whereas the good of health or the good of education or knowledge makes more sense in the personal or ethical arena. But that's not the important point. The important point, I believe, is that when you think about the common good, it is hard to imagine what would amount to have a right to the common good. What would it mean to say that we have a right to the common good? The translation doesn't seem to work properly when you're thinking about the common good. We can think about the common good as the combination of some set of other rights to have some sort of level of some sort of level of realization of the other rights that might be the common good. But then the common good plays no role in the explanation. We're just thinking about a bundle of rights. On the other hand, we can understand the common good as a grand end, for instance, as a certain state of affairs that might have value for itself. But if Veronica is right, and I think that she is on this score, that the grand end is a mistake, then what role the notion of the common good really plays? It could be argued that this complaint that I just made is based on a hidden premise, namely the premise that we can actually equate rights, particular rights, knowledge, education, to a particular good. So this is, someone might complain that this is a sort of a hidden premise, the translation of our goods to rights. And therefore, if I'm doing that, I'm already tilting the balance in favor of liberalism. Now, let us grant this counterclaim. However, it would still be the case, and then comes my second point, it would still be the case that it is part of the job of officials, at least in the conditions of modernity, it is part of the job of officials, that they should justify their actions, their decisions, their policies, their constraints. They should justify those things to their subjects, not in the sense of a theoretical endeavor, but in the sense of being able to present a narrative, an argument for the legitimacy of their decision. I do believe that Veronica is right in claiming that in their job, officials will necessarily deliberate from a practical and aspirational point of view. However, the justification they will present based on their deliberation is addressed to someone, is addressed to the political community. It is addressed in particular to those that will be affected by their actions, their decisions, their policies, their constraints. And it is at this point that pluralism and the reflexivity that are typical from modernity play an important role. If a justification is to be accepted by its audience, it must be truthful. It must be truthful. That is, it must be perceived as somehow tracking the truth on the matters, regarding the matters at hand. Now, this truth, this demand for truthfulness, will necessarily be a practical truth, not a theoretical truth, because the matters we're discussing are practical matters. However, it will still be the case that a justification that fails to be perceived as truthful will also fail to demand allegiance, will also fail to demand loyalty from the audience. And if that is the case, this justification will fail to be understood as tracking practical truths for them. This means, to put this in other words, this means that the thicker, the more substantial the justification, the more controversial it will be, given that individuals are fundamentally diverse in their psychological makeups, in their backgrounds, in their forms of life. I am not claiming, I'm not saying that there can be no space for the good in the political, but that the space for the good in the political will vary according to the political community in question and to the sort of institutional divisions and organizations that might be at work in it. So allow me to put those things together, to summarize those things together, to put those things together. Firstly, I've claimed that Veronica's model of practical deliberation is sound and fruitful. Secondly, that we do engage in that sort of endeavor when we try to flesh out particular goods in our political communities. Thirdly, that particular goods can be translated into rights, but the same is not true for the common good. Partly, that if we take seriously the duty that officials have of justifying their actions, we will see that they must provide a narrative of legitimacy for their decisions. And fifthly, that such narrative must be truthful, and that in the circumstances of modernity, reflexivity and pluralism, truthfulness tends to be in reverse proportion to thickness. Now, why does this matter? This matters because it impacts how we think about justice. The preceding remark suggests a distinction between political justice on the one hand and justice between individuals on the other. But, and this is the point that I hasten to add, this distinction is in itself a political distinction, not a conceptual one. In our individuals' relationships, friendships, love, etc., we stand in front of each other as seekers of the good, as people engaging in practical deliberation that are shaping themselves, ourselves, as life goes on. As we sometimes say regarding our partners, for instance, husbands and wives and so on, we aim at building a life together, not building two lives together. Now, and this is the point, this is not necessarily the case in the political. Political justice in our circumstances is less about building a life together and more about being able to build lives separately. In the public or political sphere, it does not matter who the other that armed me is. What matters is that he somehow restores me because of the harm he caused. This, again, is not the conceptual distinction between public and private, but rather a political distinction. The demands we place in different areas of life are just this. They are different demands. Given that this distinction is a political distinction and not a conceptual one, we can readily admit that there are forms of relationships that fall between those two levels. For instance, business partners, they are not necessarily friends. However, they stand in a relationship that places more demands on them than if they were just two random people crossing the street. So there might be kinds of relationships that will fall between those two levels, and that's perfectly fine. Now, where all of this takes us? Well, at the end of the day, I believe, it seems to me that while Aristotle was probably right regarding practical deliberation, maybe John Locke or Hobbes, but here I'm just using Locke for my example, might be right about the political. If we take a look at what Locke says in the 9th chapter of the second treatise, Locke argues that the end of the political community, the end of the political, is the protection of rights. And of course, we should be a bit careful with definitions here. But the end of the political is the protection of rights, since life outside the political, that is, life between individuals, lacked general rules that could be accepted by all, adjudication by an impartial authority, and an efficacious power to enforce rulings. Those were the things that we were lacking in a life between individuals. Now, if I'm roughly right in my remarks, then the stuff that Locke was talking about, that is what just political justice is about. Even if justice between individuals is far richer, in justice between individuals, we meet each other as seekers of the good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Very provocative. And yes, so let me pick up some points. The first, I mean, I think that, yeah, the method, the kind of practical derivation I'm trying to find is very, very different from Rawls. I would imagine that I would have said that, right? So the first is because in Rawls, as you know, it's about a reflective equilibrium, is about consider moral judgments and principles, and it's the coherence between both. So the view I'm trying to advocate is precisely that there are no principles, there is only particularity. So this is not a feature of Rawls at all. The other point is that there is a constant diachronicity, a constant change, and there is no a specific desire that we fully understand, but only when we are immersed in that. So I think that we should actually separate reflective equilibrium from what I'm trying to. But I understand where you're coming from, and understand it because there is a backward and forwards move, right? There is a reflective move, but the reflective move is substantive. And I can't demonstrate it now. I can't talk much about it, but it's in my forthcoming book in May. There are 3 chapters dedicated to practical reason, and I explain how the reflective move operates aspirationally. And I think you have read bits of this, and I'm relying on Iris Murdoch and Stanley Cavell to do that. So there is a reflection, but it's a completely different reflection as a Rawls portrait. The other point that I think we disagree, essentially, is that you think that there is the view of modernity. We are in modernity, and there's no way we can recover the classical tradition or something like that, because your claim is that modernity is right, saying that we have different psychological makeups. Is that correct? Or is it too a strong reading of your view?
I think it's correct regarding political philosophy.
Okay, good.
When you talk about like justice between individuals, let's say you and me, or Gilberto and myself, then I'm thinking we're meeting together as seekers of the good. We are demanding more of each other than we demand in the political arena. That would be.
That's good. I understand. So yes. So there is a different psychological makeup. So what you think that is because in the city there is an enormous plurality of points of views, an enormous different traditions that we coming together. That's a feature of modernity. Is that correct? Yes. And then therefore the solution for the political is only corrective justice. Right?
Might be distributive as well, but that would be.
But you refer to the harm that is compensated. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Excellent. Because precisely, I'm sorry to refer to the book. In the book again say that the corrective justice model is only backward looking. But when the judge is inviting us to, for example, give us the reasons why in this particular case, for example, in the case of Mrs. McLaughlin's case, she needs to be compensated for her psychiatric injury. It's not only a reasoning between the parties, but the judge is actually reasoning about a description of value for future people who will be involved with accidents. So I think there is a proleptic exercise here. It's not the proleptic blame of Berta Williams, but it's a proleptic exercise inviting the citizen to put themselves in the aspiration, inhabit the aspirational point of view through a description of the value that is specific through either legislation or through court. And I think that this is an effort of the law as well to invite the citizen, and only the law can do it, not education. It's not through only education, but the law can do it through the description of specific values, and in common law through the specific cases and solution of the cases, inviting the citizen to be themselves mature, to be a mature citizen. So that's why I think there is a different approach in the terms of legal and political community, how these different psychological makeup work. And then in the book, I say this is only really beautiful done through the common law. It is through the common law because it's a particular situation. For example, if there is someone who thinks that their religiosity and their symbols of religiosity is the part of their identity, the judges will consider that value. And we'll try to reach and think about how the description of the value is relevant in the specific political community. And then inviting to everyone, for example, in the school, wants to wears a cross or not, or wants to wear the specific religious symbol. The question is how, I mean, this is the law. This is an invitation. It's a prolective invitation. I don't develop that for all the aspects of public law or criminal law, but it's developed only specifically for the law of negligence. But I think there is room for applying it to other aspects. So I think our differences is about that whether this psychological makeup is permanent or the psychological makeup can be transformed to the political community and the legal community. And I am optimistic on that. I think this, so I think that and that's why I'm challenging exactly this view, because this is who we are. That's one argument. Is inevitably that we are thrown in the world with a language. We don't choose language. Yeah, you don't ask. It was Professor Reinaldo who was asking. You don't ask your baby, or do you want to speak, Chinese or Japanese? No, you start to speak Spanish to your, and with that you bring other values. So there is tradition and there is history. We are thrown in the world with a specific makeup, and the Socratic dialogue is inviting through conversation to actually mature. And I don't think that the law can be separated, or the political deliberation can be separated from the personal deliberation. And I think that's the difference in our view. That's something that I think we can have modernity, we can have different viewpoints, but I think the beauty of philosophy is the transformation of the individual through the philosophizing way. And we lost confidence as philosophers. We let the public space be dominated by the economists because we don't anymore think how philosophy can work in the public domain. That's what I think. And that's why we all seekers of the good, what I think, in your conclusion. But this is really beautiful. Thank you so much. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Do you disagree? I think, Daniel, do you want to have two different viewpoints? No? And look,
I think that in a sense, it's not so much a difference in viewpoint. Maybe I'm the more pessimistic one, because I'm all up for the idea that we can change ourselves in the sort of in the space of what I'm calling individual justice between persons. So I harm, like in personal life, I harm Martin. I can see that. He can point that out to me. He can say, "Why did you do this to me? Why I'm being hurt?" To go back to that, and I can see that and change myself. I'm more skeptical about the political arena being able to do that. But on the private, I think it's a difference more of temperament really than of philosophy.
Well, yeah, it's because I haven't developed it yet, but I think this is where I'm going. So it's so important that to have the counterbalance, and I think this is where I'm directing myself towards. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much, Professor Daniel, for being here, for accepting our invite. And we are sort of shorted on time, but Professor, would you mind taking
Of course, we should.
one or two questions?
Yes, yes. I also look at some eyes that I know will object.
So, Professor Gilberto and Professor Carlos Federico.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Veronica. I promise I'll make it very quick. I'm glad I was able to see the exchange between you and Professor Murata, because my question actually was about precisely Iris Murdoch. I see that you mentioned her in The Sublime and the Good in this paper. Two questions, really, two quick questions. First, this paper, this lecture specifically, more than the others, is very reminiscent to me of Iris Murdoch, particularly in the analogy between the sun and the good, right? So I'd like to ask you first, how important are Murdoch's views on attention and seeing in this process of practical deliberation that you defend, that you articulate? This is the first question. And the second one came to me when I was listening to Professor Murata. I'm not sure if he himself would agree, but maybe I would put his terms, the way I interpret them, more simply in the following way. How would you respond, your theory on the common good and your rebuttal of the common good as grand end, to theories that try to vindicate liberalism, not exactly in the terms that Professor Murata tried to defend, but in terms like Judith Shklar, for example. Judith Shklar and the liberalism of fear, because she defends, I don't think she has a theory of the good, but she has a theory of the bad. And she tries to defend liberalism from that end. So how would you respond to that defense of liberalism? That is certainly different from your view. So thank you very much indeed.
This is a very good question. Thank you. Something I wanted to say about the narrative aspect and the legitimacy, I think, and that comes and connects beautifully with the Iris Murdoch question. So for Murdoch, there is always a move of reason, right? And the move of reason, as you say, is through attention. But the way I read it is that desire is thought as well. And then therefore, your desire moves with your thought, with your thinking. And in the example of the mother-in-law, I think there is a bit of I try to criticize her in this way. So remember, the mother-in-law thinks that their son has married below his social rank. He thinks that his daughter-in-law is a vulgar lady, is too noisy and so on, pretentious and so on. So she says 10 years pass, she's isolated from the couple, and then she asks herself, oh, let me look again, right? And she revises her view on her daughter-in-law. And now her view on the daughter-in-law is that her daughter-in-law is joyful. What before was impolite is now, joie de vivre. And what before was vulgarity is honesty and frank ways of expressing herself. Now, I think there is an artificiality in this example, because what I'm saying in the book is that the move of reasoning is through others, actually. And the example works because she has isolated the couple from the mother-in-law. But I think the example it really works when someone has told the mother-in-law, oh, don't you think you're snobbish? You're a classist. Don't you think? And then probably she has grandchildren. So the experience of life has move her reasoning. And I think this is a much more realistic picture of how a reasoning works through others, the confrontation with others. And that's a question of narrative and legitimacy, because I think you're right. You talk about truthfulness, but I would say practical truth is very important because it's a transformation of desire. And Iris Murdoch makes a distinction between fantasy and imagination. And in the liberation, imagination is towards truth. Truth instructs us. And that's precisely the exercise of the practical wisdom of the phronesis. The person of practical wisdom pays attention to things you didn't have. So the mother-in-law has developed a way of looking at and attention to the daughter-in-law she didn't have before. But it's all, and I'm arguing, well, precisely, this is through the dialectic of conversation. is the philosophical method at the end. Within the philosophical method is all the theories of epistemology, metaphysics. No, it's when we sit in the cafe with our best friend and we ask, are you sure you want to do that? Because the consequences are these and these and these. And we take seriously her premises and we take seriously her feelings. And of course, that's why it's so important to have wise friends and friends who are. So philosophy, I mean, it trickles down into the daily life, the deliberation. I said yesterday, the syndicate, the union, the church, the school, the council, the university, the parliament, the courts, everywhere. If we take seriously the premises of each other, there is an equality of the good we share. Your view on the vice, very good, yeah. So I think there is a presupposition of Hobbesian view that we are rational, and that's why, you know, we are by nature evil, we are by nature bad. Mm-hmm. And I think this explains the whole spectrum of agency, this view. So in a society that you deprive the other of the conversation, then you are depriving of something really important, the possibility of transformation. And that's why I think liberalism is based purely on negative freedom, right? It's pure negative freedom. And the foundation of negative freedom is that we are essentially rational egoists. There's no way we can change. But this is precisely the second part of the work that I haven't developed yet, but it's contesting the distinction between external and internal freedom and positive and negative freedom. And of course, Isaiah Berlin and all the tradition, Quentin Skinner is so important. But this is the second volume. Yeah, thank you so much. This is a very important question and a very strong point. Yeah, and that gives meal to your water, water to your meal. Sorry.
Professor Veronica. Professor Veronica, thanks a lot for the talk. And my question is very simple and very determinate. Concerning common good as a grand end, and I'm thinking about the third objection, the third point, why common good can be conceived as a grand end. We do have values in every society, including the Constitution, that are viewed as grand ends and are important for social cohesion or for arguments about what should we do when a case happens that supposedly violates these values. For example, we're talking a lot in Brazil about democracy, about the threats to democracy, so democracy as a grand end, political equality, equal respect, dignity, environmental protection, and so on. So I would like to know what is the problem of having these grand and these common goods conceived as grand ends? If the problem is if they are fiction, for example, if they do not work the way we think they work in our deliberation, or if the problem is to think of them as if they were determining the action. Because if the problem is thinking about them as determining the particulars of the action, could then be saved as common good, as grand ends, if we reconcile them with a good account of practical reason, as you have told us here. So could we have these common goods as grand ends if we acknowledge that they do not determine the particulars of the decisions, because there are no principles in practical reason that determine the particular of the decision. The particular is always open, always indeterminate, and it can violate, for example, or literally at least, the principle that was in the beginning the most important for this deliberation. I'm thinking of the Plato's example, Aquinas example on giving back the giving back an arm, a weapon for the neighbor. So if we conceive these common goods as grand ends, but concile this with a very good account of practical reason, as the one that you have presented to us, and a very good account of deliberation, can we still save this common good as grand end and preserve the importance of these values for political communities? Because when we have those problems of justice, we talk about grand ends and we deem them as important, although indeterminate. So thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, I think you're right. Your worry is very legitimate. So you think, well, we have principles. Do not return you have to return your this is what is your property. You don't have a right to other people's property, even if it's a weapon. Well, what happens if the man is mad, right? That's the case. So it seems that there is an application here of that principle. Oh, this is an exception. He's mad, I can't return it. Since in this particular fact, the principle of you ought to return doesn't apply, because in this particular fact is clear. So in the Constitution, we have many principles: the principle of dignity, freedom of speech, and so on, or most of constitutions, equality, and so on. So your worry is, what are we going to do with these principles? We're constantly exercising. Actually, it seems like we consider these principles in light of the particular fact. It seems like we're acting more like a Dworkinian. We read these facts in the best light, and it's only the principles who can illuminate this, how these facts really work together, right, in a coherent way. But I'm just trying to pay attention here to something that happened historically before. There's an origin of us before we had the constitutions, before we had the principle, before anything. So there was an engagement through our traditions with way of thinking and values. It's a very naive, primitive way of thinking. And I'm saying this is in the guise of the good. Is this practical reason? This is the foundation of everything. The principles cannot be used to make an inference, because this is mathematical thinking. And that's why the practical syllogism, Aristotle said it, and also Elizabeth Anscombe say the why question methodology, these are just devices, heuristic, to unpack the structure of practical reason. So in the traditions, in the language, in the way we behave, there is a long history of understanding the values. And you're right, then we formulated our principles. Then we can have codes. They're reminders of what is this process of deliberation. And they're parasitic if they're going to make sense of the process of transformation. I hope that does it make sense, but that's the way I'm trying to formulate it. But I don't think this is precisely enough. But I'm trying to say something about the tradition and the way we understood ourselves. And the Constitution is not the hyper good. This is what I'm trying to say, no? To copy the hyper good view. There can be hyper goods because we're constantly deliberating. And that's why that we transform the principles and readjust them. So I hope does it help, but it's not a complete and a satisfactory answer. I'm aware of that. Yeah.
So I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Professor Veronica, Martin, Professor Morata. Once again, thank you. We will be back on Friday, same place, same time, for the last session of this first one, because after you got published on May, you'll be back on the second semester. Okay.
Yeah, my hometown is just a few kilometers.
Oh, okay. Send us the calendar and we'll buy the tickets. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Until Friday.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.